I'm Mark Danner. In 1982, I met Charles de Foucauld in a mysterious way, or rather, through the Spirit of God, Charles de Foucauld met me. I was a sophomore in college and was on a semester abroad program in Jerusalem. I had fallen away from the church and was confused, seeking, and very moved to be in Jerusalem, and was walking through the streets of the old city when I happened to walk into a religious bookstore. I found some prayer cards, and one of those cards had a prayer in French. And having grown up speaking French, thanks to my French mother, I was attracted to it. I took it with me and even ended up memorizing the prayer of abandonment to God, asking God to do with me as He willed. Little did I know that was the great prayer of abandonment of Charles de Foucauld. And that prayer has accompanied me all these years. And the friendship with Charles de Foucauld has been really a living one in so many ways, having been moved by his life that I learned about years later, and continue to be moved to this day. And that's why I'm so happy to be commenting on this documentary and on Charles de Foucauld and on his friends. I want to say a word about the documentary because it in itself it's quite amazing in that in half an hour the Net for God producers, and this is the documentary production team of the Catholic community Chemin Neuf, the New Path community, which produces many documentaries over the years. They've had 20 seasons of documentaries. In 30 minutes, they've been able to capture the life of Charles de Foucauld and also the life of communities that sprang up after his death. So this is a real encapsulation of how Charles de Foucault's spirituality was born out of what appeared to be a useless life. He didn't have anybody join him in the desert. He didn't have any converts. He didn't even die a martyr's death as he was prepared to. And so seemingly so useless. And he felt himself so often useless. And yet he had an extraordinary trust that God was doing great things in his life. And he didn't live to see what those great things were, but this divine plan really flourished like a mustard seed growing into a huge tree after Foucault's death. So I'm very grateful for this documentary that really paints not only his life, but that flourishing that came after his death.
You ask me what my life is about. It is the life of a missionary monk founded on 3 principles: the imitation of the hidden life of Jesus of Nazareth, the adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, a life lived among the most forgotten people.
Charles de Foucauld was born a stone's throw from Strasbourg Cathedral on September 16, 1858. He was followed 3 years later by his sister Marie. They lost both their parents very suddenly within a few months.
One of the aspects of Charles de Foucault's life that I can really relate to is how moved he was, even before he returned to the Catholic Church, by his encounter with Muslims and with the culture and civilization and spirituality of Islam. In his case, it was when he did this extraordinary year of dangerous exploration in Morocco. And that's certainly something that has again and again touched my life as a Christian, in that the deep faith of my Muslim friends, their spirituality, has deepened my Christian faith, that their witness calls me to say how great you are, God, and to go deeper into my own Christian faith. So, like Foucault, I can say that the witness of my Muslim friends deepens my love for Christ, who is the Alpha and the Omega, and who is the essence and meaning of all things, including Islam.
He was an adventurer at heart. His boredom was relieved when a woman entered his life. He went to fight in Algeria, and that's where he discovered his true vocation as an explorer. He was always bold in his decision-making, and that's how he was driven to explore Morocco, which was at the time considered quite extraordinary. Seeing his faith, these souls living constantly in the presence of God, gave me a glimpse of something greater and more real than my social occupations.
When Charles de Foucauld entered the confessional of his spiritual father, Abbé Henri Houvelin, he was 28 years old. He had seen a lot of life. He had been orphaned when he was 5 years old. He was adopted by his grandfather. He had entered the military against his will. He had inherited a huge amount of money. In many ways, he went through many lives, like all of us, before he experienced the greatest change in his life, what he had been looking for, what he had been searching for all of his life. At 28, he found that his real longing and his real desire was really for God. He had been a disobedient soldier. He had brought his mistress to his military barracks in Algeria, and he had done explorations of Morocco. He was a very brilliant man in many ways. He was a scientist. He was an excellent artist. But he was always a man, as he said, who experienced great emptiness. And even though he had moments of real frivolity and perhaps happiness, he realized that there was something that was missing. He grew up in a Catholic family, and he had seen Catholicism, like every young Frenchman of his age and his time. But it was through the influence of a priest who had visited his cousin, Marie de Bundy. He had come to know this priest, Abbé Houvelin. They discussed religion, and Foucault had a real sense, I think, of the transcendence of God while he was in Morocco, and also while he was in Algeria. He had seen Muslims pray 5 times a day. And he said so often in his writings that he saw something that he had never seen before. He had seen people pray. I think what he really said was he experienced transcendence. I'm not sure how that squares with his Catholic experience. I think perhaps his Catholic experience was ritual, beautiful, liturgical ritual, but he really didn't seem to find any companionship in that. God wasn't real, if you want. And so he prayed often, God, if you exist, show yourself to me, which is a prayer. It's an act of faith, really, in many ways. God, if you exist, show yourself to me. And so after this interesting search at the age of 28, he goes into the confessional of his friend Abbé Houvelin in the parish church of St. Augustine in Paris. And he has gone there several times just for the quiet, because he really had fallen in love with the desert. The desert was very much a part of his experience. I often wonder if the desert didn't reflect his own inner silence, if the desert didn't reflect his own barrenness, his own hollowness, He went into the confessional, and there he told Houvelin that he really wanted to believe. And almost a mystical moment, Houvelin said, just go to confession and see what happens. And he did, and it is the great moment of his conversion. I begin with that because I don't think we look at the word conversion more solidly, if you want. The word conversion really is metanoia. It's really to change your mind, to change your direction. Metanoia really means for your heart to melt. It was the experience of Charles de Foucauld in that confessional. He said, the moment I believed that God existed, I could live for nothing else. I think it's an important point in his life to begin with, because it wasn't just finding a religion. It wasn't just coming back to Catholicism. It wasn't coming back to the creed. I think Foucauld fell in love with Jesus of Nazareth. It was a moment of transcendent metanoia, and Foucauld really fell in love with Jesus of Nazareth. There's a difference between being in love and loving. I'm still not sure what that is, of course, but being in love has a sense of passion, and it has a sense of really wanting to give ourselves completely to find the object of that love. So this experience of conversion brought Charles de Foucauld, through his spiritual director, directly to the Gospels. And this is where I think Foucauld, like his spiritual friend Therese, they didn't know each other, of course, but Therese and Charles de Foucauld have what I call a real biblical, evangelical spirituality, even though there were wonderful pious books and all kinds of good Catholic reading at the time. Foucauld, like Therese, went through his spiritual director immediately to the four Gospels. It was there that he took every phrase, every word of Jesus. He actually wrote the New Testament out by longhand. He made his own New Testament, if you want, to make sure that he knew every word, every passage where Jesus spoke. He wrote all the words of Jesus in longhand. He put together a composite, if you want, and he called it the one model. We have one model only, and that is Jesus. We don't want to be like any saint. We don't want to be like any great person. We have one model, he said, and that is Jesus of Nazareth. So this conversion is one of the remarkable moments in his life, and I think, of course, in the lives of many saints. But I see in the conversion of Foucauld, I see someone who is so madly, passionately in love with Jesus. I've looked at Charles de Foucauld and studied him for 50 years. I never read St. Charles de Foucauld, now St. Charles de Foucauld. I never read him without longing, almost jealously longing, to love Jesus the way he did. I just see a man so passionately in love with the man Jesus of Nazareth. It also had something to do, certainly, with Charles de Foucault's time in the Holy Land. I believe that after Foucault was converted, his conversion, he went to live in the Holy Land. And there I think he found Jesus as a person. When you travel that road and you see the Sea of Galilee and you travel all these places, the New Testament doesn't become a fairy tale anymore. It becomes the place where God became a human being. And it's overwhelming to think of the canonic love of God, that this tiny, insignificant place, Nazareth, that this was where God humanized himself. And so it was, I think, in the Holy Land that Charles de Foucauld began to, if you want, love Jesus as the three-dimensional person. And at the time, they were greatly influenced, of course, by the new devotion to the Sacred Heart. And the devotion to the Sacred Heart was really a renewal of the humanity of Jesus. In French spirituality at the time, the revelation of the Sacred Heart was quite a revolutionary experience because it was really the beginning of a very exciting time of the humanity of Christ. So there were a number of things that brought together this conversion. But what does it mean for us to look at that moment of metanoia? I think that Foucauld, Charles de Foucauld, to me, is a perfect example of an icon. An icon is a window into heaven. Our understanding of icons is that when you look at the sacred image, you're looking at something that's deified. I think that Charles de Foucauld, for me, is an icon. He's a window. He's transparent. He's glass. I can look through Charles de Foucauld, and I realize this is a gift to me. I realize that I was found, that Charles de Foucauld found me, just like Jesus found the lost sheep. I think Foucauld found me. I was 21, and I was desperate to find someone like him who wanted to live a simple life, a poor life, a life completely on the gospel, a complete dependence on God. I was young, and like Foucauld, I was gangbusters for God.
He began to see that God is love, that Christ is a loving heart first and foremost, and so it was his extreme commitment that would lead him to understand the humanity of Christ.
He went to see the Mother Abbess and asked her, "Mother, I want to become a priest." And the abbess couldn't believe her ears because on several occasions she had asked him to go to Jerusalem to see the Latin Patriarch to ask him to be ordained. And each time he had answered, "I'm unworthy, unworthy."
He wanted to become a priest because he saw that in the Holy Land one could only found an order if one was a priest. During his retreat, preparing him for the diaconate and the priesthood, he was awestruck by the stories of the lost sheep and the Eucharistic banquet. The poorest who were living in the gutter must be called and led to the Master's banquet. Straight away, he dropped the idea of the Holy Land and said, "I will go to live near Morocco, and when a priest is allowed to enter, I shall do so. I can see that Muslims have slaves of their own, so I will found a community of slaves, like the Christian community." And this is what he attempted to do.
So to understand one of the essences of Foucault's engagement with the Tuareg peoples and all who came by him in his poor little hut in southern Algeria is to delve into this most beautiful and deep concept of sacred hospitality. The notion that I welcome the other as a guest into my heart, and that the other is a good for me. And that is a spirituality that is absolutely relevant to today, and something that Charles de Foucauld lived in all his engagements, pouring himself out, wanting to be a hermit and praying all day, but in the end he would be summoned all day and into the night to treat the wounds of various visitors, to feed the poor, to be always a brother to those around him. So this sacred hospitality is very relevant. It's very deep, and it's something that can be truly a method for approaching reality. In fact, I was reading Father Giussani, the Italian educator and founder of the lay movement Communion and Liberation, about this going towards the other. And he says something that made me really think of Charles de Foucauld in this regard. He said, it's not necessary in order to be a friend to someone, in this case, think of Foucauld being a friend to the Tuaregs, for him to discover that what you say is true and come with you. It's not necessary. Rather, it's I who go with him because of that little filing of truth that he has. Only the certainty of truth makes us feel immediately fraternal and maternal and fond of every fragment of truth that exists in each person. And that's something that the life of Charles de Foucauld and his followers have taught us, and it's something I'm very grateful for. Now, there's another aspect of Foucault's life that is not explicitly described in the documentary, but you can see it quite evidently, and that is the story of Charles de Foucauld as a pioneer in the church, really one of the first to explicitly live his life as a worker priest, as a monk who went out of the monastery to live among the people, and specifically the poorest of the poor, and to pour his life out for them. And that at that time, this was very unusual. He was also a pioneer in calling for the religious communities to engage with the laity, and indeed to create a fraternity of laypersons living a spirituality with the religious as well. I mean, this is one of the distinctive characteristics of the family, the different spiritual families of Charles de Foucauld, and one that today, with the various spiritual charisms in the church, we can see almost take for granted. But in Foucault's time, this was very unusual to call for this kind of lay engagement, and also that it be working side by side with the religious communities.
What does it mean for us to listen to those words of Jesus, those overwhelming words of Jesus? Foucault said that Jesus said, "This is my body, this is my blood." The same way he looked at the little ones and he said, "Whatever you do to the little ones, you do to me." He said the mouth that consecrated bread and wine was the same mouth that consecrated the little ones. And we are all the little ones. The same mouth that said, "This is my body, this is my blood." He also looked at people and Jesus said, "And this is my body, and this is my blood."
So in the documentary, we encounter some members of the spiritual family of Foucault, religious, lay persons, and this, like I said, it has become like the mustard seed that grew into a fantastic tree all over the world and over time and history. And I think it's very important to pause and point out some of these friends of Charles de Foucauld, whose lives and spiritualities were deeply moved, and who in turn have touched the lives of countless persons. So not just within the spiritual family of Foucault, but there are others who, like Catherine Doherty, the founder of Madonna House in Combermere, Canada, was deeply touched by Foucault. Christian de Cherguet and his fellow Trappist monks who were martyred in Algeria, and whose lives were portrayed in the extraordinary film Of Gods and Men, was also in that brotherhood and friendship with Foucault. Then there's the martyred Jesuit priest Paolo Dall'Olio, who disappeared in 2013 into the hands of ISIS in Syria. But he and his fellow priest, Father Jacques Murad, who's alive today, founded a community of welcome between Christians and Muslims in the St. Moses Monastery in Syria. And then there is the ongoing extraordinary work of the Dominicans in Cairo, whose Institute for the Study of Middle East History, Middle East Affairs in Cairo was founded by three priests, one of whom I had the honor of studying under, Father George Anawati, in 1987. And these priests have touched the lives of countless, the priests still to today in Cairo, and they are right out of the spirituality as well of sacred hospitality of Charles de Foucauld. And I'd just like to signal one priest who I really hope someday we can, in the American English-speaking world discover. This is the French priest Serge de Beaurecueil, who was a Dominican and who gave up a brilliant career in academic research to become, like Charles de Foucauld, a worker priest. He gave up everything and left for Kabul, Afghanistan, to serve the poor orphaned boys of that wrecked country destroyed by war.
Greetings. I'm very glad to be here today to speak to you about Charles de Foucauld and looking at him from a Muslim perspective and from the perspective of Christian-Muslim engagement. So I will talk about three different interrelated things. So we can begin with talking about the colonialist context of Christian missionary work in the Islamic world. Christian missionaries have often been seen with distrust by Muslims, as with people of other religious traditions, due to the colonial era where Christian missionaries were often seen as the cultural or religious arm of foreign occupation. So if foreign powers like France or Britain were exploiting and kind of taking resources and trying to bring European modes and ways into Muslim countries or other parts of the world outside of Islam as well, Christian missionaries were seen to do something even worse, in a certain sense, of trying to dismantle or attack the most important and most cherished beliefs and practices, oftentimes connected with religion, of conquered peoples. And this was all, of course, also was happening in an environment where Europe posited itself as being in these lands not for exploitation, but for the betterment of these people, right? So the France's idea, for example, of mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission, so that Europe had civilization, the rest of the people of the world, including the Islamic world, were backward, were some, maybe even savage and primitive in various kinds of ways, or degenerate, and it was the white man's burden, to quote Kipling, to reform them. And Christianity, for many, including Foucault, played a role in this civilizing and taming of the natives, so to speak. However, despite the fact that in many ways Foucault was a man of his time, and you find some of this rhetoric in Foucault, he was also very different from the kind of aggressive proselytizing missionaries that many Muslims distrusted, because he embraced the idea of brotherly love, of being a brother to all, the universal brother, as he said. So though there was very much a imbalance in power in some ways, because Foucault was part of the colonizing forces, I mean, at least country-wise, and then the Muslims that he lived among. Nonetheless, he lived his life among Muslims as a kind of a witness, what Massignon, his friend, who's a great scholar of Islam, calls a witness living a life of Christic holiness among Muslims.
Now, there are two other friends of Foucault that very few in the United States and the English-speaking world know about. But one of them was his younger spiritual brother, and the man that Foucault really wanted to recruit to come live with him, to be his companion in the deserts of southern Algeria. And that is the great French scholar and sage and mystic Louis Massignon, who died in 1962. Massignon is an extraordinary figure of the 20th century, probably one of the greatest Catholic figures, but very little known. And Massignon is responsible for carrying on the legacy of Foucault by really making sure that Foucault became known. It was Massignon who pushed for the first biography of Foucault to be written. It was Massignon who carefully edited and promoted and pushed for his spiritual rule, his directory for religious and lay associations to be accepted by the church. And it was Massignon who deeply imbibed the spirituality of sacred hospitality and then lived that out in so many encounters that touched so many in the church. In fact, Massignon is probably responsible for shaping the church's understanding of Islam today through the Vatican II's Nostra Aetate document and so many others. Massignon is a giant, but a saintly giant who, like Foucault, became a worker as well among the poor. This is one of the greatest scholars in Europe, would spend his weekends teaching math and French to poor Algerian immigrants, just to give some examples. So to really understand Foucault is to understand those he loved and his friends, and Louis Massignon is certainly one of them. Another one that is really not known at all, and I think hopefully someday will be known throughout the church, is the extraordinary Lebanese priest, Father Afif Oseiran, who was born in 1919 and died in 1988. Father Afif Oseiran was a convert to Catholicism from Shiite Islam. And his story is truly extraordinary, but he became a postulant of the Little Brothers of Jesus and was very much committed to living the life of spirituality of Charles de Foucauld. And in the end, the Little Brothers of Jesus decided not to accept him. They saw in his vocation not one of contemplation and, a monastic type vocation, but rather that he should really be among the people. And that he accepted, Father Afif accepted that and went back to Lebanon and became a worker priest in the Maronite Catholic rite, and went on to give his life to young men who had just been released from prison in Lebanon and vocational education. But Father Afif Oseiran is one of the giants in the Catholic Church in understanding Islam, and especially in understanding the necessity of enculturing the faith into spirituality that can be understood by Arabs and by Muslims. So these two, Louis Massignon and Father Afif Oseiran, are two great friends of Charles de Foucauld, and ones that I hope we'll all get to know and discover.
Now let's turn to his encounters with real life Muslims, and we can look at two different parts of his life. His early life, which illustrates a beautiful principle that we'll come to about, that can be a very great help in envisaging the very purpose of interreligious encounter, and his later life, where he went and lived with the Tuareg. So as far as his early life is concerned, it is remarkable that his own journey, like that of his friend Massignon, came to be because of Islam and Muslims. He was someone who was not a very practicing Christian, and he, as a young man, and he went to Morocco and Algeria, to North Africa, and moved by things such as the perpetual invocation of God among Muslims in those lands, the constant prayer that he saw in prostration, the calls to prayer that reverberated over Muslim towns, the name of God being repeated in everyday conversation all the time, what he calls a meditative witness of the grandeur of faith. You could see all of that, and it really changed something within him. So that at one point he even wrote that he was thinking of becoming a Muslim, but eventually the journey led him to an idea of Christian holiness that was very close in some ways to Islam and to Islamic spirituality. And he wrote of Islam after he visited Morocco, saying in his young age, I liked Islam very much. Simplicity of dogma, simplicity of hierarchy, simplicity of morality. And in his own Christian perspective, as we'll see, has that mark of that. It's somehow touched by that in his simplicity that he lives in his whole life. And so, and this is an example of a very deep level of interreligious encounter, where one learns to go deeper in one's own spiritual tradition through experiencing or witnessing something of another spiritual tradition. So one of my teachers, the Catholic theologian Chester Gillis at Georgetown, has said that the purpose of interreligious encounter is that so we can grow in our faith but through interacting with and learning from another. And we see this in the life of Charles de Foucauld.
He believed that small farmers are needed in the Ahagar region, small Christian traders, priests as well, but incognito priests, that is to say, scientific priests who carry out scientific work, but priests at the same time, close to the surrounding population. What attracted me was a life following in the footsteps of Jesus according to the gospel and nothing else. Then I became attracted by the people of the desert more than the desert itself. The people of the desert and those with another culture. And for me, getting used to another culture was an essential part of my religious life, because this implied an asceticism, a complete change of outlook, and a hospitable attitude towards others. In my opinion, this is the love of God for all men. This is at the heart of Charles de Foucauld's spirituality. This all-encompassing love for every man and woman, whoever they may be.
So turning to his later life, we see that he lives among the Tuareg. And unlike many other missionaries who would try to westernize non-Christians, he's fully integrated into that world. He is into the very, for example, even in the video, in the current Council of Agadez, talks about how the little brothers, even today, after the example of Foucauld, live in friendship and are integrated into the everyday life of the Muslim communities that they are in, so that Muslims and Christians can inspire each other in the life of faith together. Again, a very, another perhaps principle of interreligious encounter that we find in Charles de Foucauld, that of a common, instead of converting each other, a common inspiring to be holy, right? And we also see, for example, among the Muslims that he interacted with, we see a genuine respect. I mean, we don't have too many first-hand sources, but we see a genuine respect from the Tuareg, and an appreciation of his simplicity, his gentleness, his charity, his piety, and as well as his honesty. And his honesty actually made him an arbitrator among among the Muslims that he lived among. And it's also important to say that in these all of these virtues that Muslims saw in him, and perhaps this was unbeknown to him, but Muslims saw something of Islam, of the of early Islam, of Islamic spirituality, which speaks deeply of this kind of simplicity and of renunciation, of piety and honesty and so on. And this brings us to the third topic of spiritual kinship with Islam and Muslims. So on this topic, Musa Ag Abastan, who was the Tuareg chief, talked when Charles de Foucauld died. He stated, and I'm quoting here, "Charles the Marabout has not only died for you, he has died for us too. May God have mercy on him, and may we meet him in paradise." So there are two remarkable things here. One is that that Foucauld is being called a Marabout, and as he was called in his lifetime by Muslims, and not only other Frenchmen, a French Marabout. And Marabouts, coming from the Arabic word Murabit, were Muslim holy men and continue to be Muslim holy men, oftentimes Sufi masters, sometimes saints, in the context of Africa, in North Africa and West Africa. And they're really the most oftentimes seen as the holiest of people. So it's already remarkable that someone of another religious tradition is seen, put into this category of people who are considered the holiest people in Muslim society, right? These are people who follow and teach the Sufi path. The Sufi path is the path of Islamic spirituality, or the Islamic mystical and spiritual tradition. And but Marabouts were not only spiritual men; they were also known for caring about the economic, social, religious stability of the areas that they lived in. They were admired for their justice, for their righteousness, for their transparency, and their aloofness from political powers. And so that itself is very interesting, that perhaps it tells us something relating back to what we said about colonialism, that that the Muslims he lived among did not see him as an agent of French colonialism, but as doing something quite different, as an agent of holiness, even though this might be of a foreign tradition. Right. So I want to just end with, or actually say one more thing here before I end, and that's a couple of ideas that you find, like I mentioned with simplicity. There's other ideas such as that of holy or spiritual poverty, which are very much ideas in Islamic and Sufi spiritual traditions. In fact, all people who follow one of the lineages of Sufism are called fuqara, the poor in God, people who embrace spiritual poverty and renounce the world. The idea of dying to oneself and the world, for example, "die before you die," is a quotation often attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, but probably not from him, but it's widely used in Sufism. So Foucault one time prayed that he wanted to die to himself and the world and all that is not God and his will. Finally, I want to end with some ideas from Ali Murad, who was a distinguished French Muslim scholar, who's written the only book I know with a Muslim perspective on Charles de Foucauld. Here's my library copy of it, Christian Hermit in the Islamic World, the English translation. And he said that one of the resonances between Muslims and Islam and the spirituality of Charles de Foucauld was Foucault's commitment to the imitation of Christ, this Christian idea of the imitation of Christ. And because Christ is a major prophet in Islam, he also has a particular kind of sanctity, what we can call, certain Sufi authors call the Christic kind of archetype. And this archetype, or this kind of sanctity, is one which is given to the inward life, to contemplation, to renunciation, as well as charity and love. And these are all traits attributed to Jesus, to Christ, in Islamic traditions. And so when Muslims met someone like Charles de Foucauld, they saw something of Christ in him and this kind of Christic sanctity. And again, this could be another lesson for interreligious or Christian Muslim engagement in that there are particular themes within these traditions that in which there is a spiritual kinship, in which the two traditions can speak in a mutually illuminating and fruitful manner.
And finally, Charles de Foucauld, as a spiritual friend and any friend who is passionate for us to get to know the one he loves, Christ, is also an intercessor. And I think he's an intercessor especially for a couple of groups of people today. And one is the young folks who are living lives like he did at one point, which are just full of a thirst for truth, but seeking it in all the wrong ways. Foucault was what we'd call today a party animal. I mean, and that's why he's so familiar with that anguish of the heart that's trying to fill itself with meaning through alcohol, through drugs, sex, through any kind of extreme behavior. He really is an intercessor. And for parents who want to pray for a companion to their lost kids, he is really such a great intercessor. He's also a great intercessor for those of all walks of life who seem to think that their lives are useless, that they're not having any impact, that they're not accomplishing anything. And he is somebody who showed that availability to Christ, that abandonment to the Lord, plants a seed that maybe not in our lifetimes, and it's certainly not right away in his lifetime, had any results. But that's God who takes that desire and gives it the full sense and the full meaning across time and history. So he's the patron saint of those who also think of their lives as useless. Charles de Foucauld truly is a friend, and it's my experience that amazing doors are opened when you get to know him and befriend him.
But what do we draw from the life of Charles de Foucauld if we say that he's an icon, a window into heaven, that he's a piece of glass, as I say? What do we draw from his life? Why is he perhaps so important in other countries? I think he will become more important in the United States as we learn more about him. But what appeals to people about him? For me, the word inclusive has become a rather sacred word. The word inclusive perhaps has started religiously and in the Catholic Church with inclusive language. We want our language to be inclusive. We want to watch our grammar, who we exclude and who we include. And I think we're all sensitive to that, of course, because no one wants to be excluded. I think that the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, I think we see that Jesus of Nazareth does everything he can to include the excluded. And the people who decided who was excluded, strangely, become the excluded. I'm sure that in a certain sense he never excluded them, but the people who were critical of certain people, who excluded them from the love of God, from the reign of God, from the law of God. But the word inclusive is a very good special word. For me, it's a holy word. Because God includes everything in creation. Everything is included in creation. And the story of creation, for me, is really the effort of God to include every molecule, every leaf. So we see that Jesus is truly the Son of the Father. That Jesus includes every human heart and every human hunger. I often think of the great example of Jesus, the loaves and the fish, 5,000 people, not including women and children, and we all know the story of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes. And at the end, there's 12 baskets, and everyone is worthy of the miracle. No one is unworthy of the miracle. I sometimes think, Jesus, you can say that the apostles will, hear confessions and find out, who's okay, and they get miraculous bread and fish, but make sure that everybody's worthy, and everybody's worthy of the miracles of Jesus. Everyone. And this kind of inclusive love, Charles de Foucauld was able to cut through in some way, able to look at Muslims, and in his day, there was a great question: who was going to be saved? He went to a world that was completely pagan, as the word was pagan. And he was certainly, when he first went there, he brought his Catholic mind. What happens to these people? And many missionaries suffered thinking, they had to get these people baptized, get them to be Catholics, so they would be responsible for their salvation. I don't think Foucault ever really went through that. I think, honestly, because of his closeness to Jesus, he really, I'd like to think, as Paul says, have within you the mind that was in Christ Jesus. Have within you the heart that was in Christ Jesus. And perhaps at the time of Foucault, perhaps there was, and sometimes there can be, a Catholic fundamentalism. Sometimes we look at the Gospels perhaps as fundamentalists, and don't look at the spirit, and don't look at the inclusiveness. Sometimes we almost read the Gospel as who's in and who's out. I came from a mixed marriage. My mother was a Baptist, and my good Baptist relatives were not sure that us Catholics were going to be with them. But that wasn't so bad, because most of my Catholic relatives were very convinced my Protestant relatives were not going to be with us. It was a very judgmental time. Now, I don't understand completely how Charles de Foucauld looked at the most amazing people and saw God in them. He went right to the heart of every human being. I really believe, that that's the gift of total union with our Lord Jesus Christ. That's union with God. Union with God, for me, is to be able to see God. To see God in the heart of every human being. So, certainly Foucault saw Muslims in prayer. He became very much a part of the Muslim community. He very much was a part of their celebrations. And Foucault and Louis Massignon, who's also being mentioned, Charles de Foucauld and Louis Massignon, very unique among the Catholic Church, because Charles de Foucauld was a convert to Catholicism through Islam. Louis Massignon was a convert to Catholicism through Islam. This is extraordinary. And this is why today Foucault has something very important to speak to the church in terms of missiology. We don't perhaps understand a vocation of presence. Maybe it's a kind of a French spirituality. We want to be present to one another. But there's nothing useful. What are we going to get out of it? What are we going to produce? This is why Foucault is, in many ways, a difficult but a good example for us. He had nothing to show at the end of his life. As the name of the video is, a useless life. No life is useless. We look at his life. He believed that he was a grain of wheat. He said over and over, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it's just a grain of wheat. But if it dies, it bears fruit. I wish I could say that about myself, that somehow or other my life is going to be fruitful. I don't see that. I don't have children. I don't have grandchildren. But Foucault believed that he was to be the seed. Now, the witness of the Catholic Church to Islam is a tremendous question. And we certainly, according to the Holy Father, we are not a proselytizing church. That upsets many people. I think that what we're all about, I think what we're all about is attraction. I think that we are, as Foucault said, we cry the gospel with our lives. We cry the gospel with our lives. Hopefully, this is attraction. He said, I hope that people will say, I'm a good man. And because I'm a good man and because I love God, I'm a good man. My religion must be good. You know, my religion. And he struggled, of course, he was a representative of France. And France was a colonial power. And France had gone into Algeria. And if you know anything at all, France believed they owned Algeria. There was a serious Algerian crisis when Algeria separated from France. And then, perhaps most important when we look at the spirituality of Charles de Foucauld is his message of Nazareth. Nazareth. It's so simple, it's almost difficult to explain. That you and I live in Nazareth. That our Lord Jesus Christ lived for 30 years. He was in the seminary for 30 years, a long time to be in the seminary. He had a 2.5, 3-year ministry, and he was 30 years. And he learned humility, and he learned obscurity, and he learned people. I think that's the great message of Nazareth, that Jesus learned people. It says in the Gospel of John, I think, he understood people, he read people. And yet he was able to look into the heart of every human being, this beautiful Jesus of Nazareth. And this is what Nazareth is for us. That Nazareth is the place where God incarnates himself, where God enfleshes himself in our lives. Your love for your children, your love for one another. Human love is holy love. Human love is divine love. This is what Nazareth is all about. That human love is the consecrated love. That love consecrates bread and wine. And that human love, we consecrate one another. We change one another's lives. And so the mystery of Nazareth, I really encourage you and urge you to look at this remarkable Charles de Foucauld. There isn't enough on him in English. We need to have more translations, but look at him and read about him. Be encouraged by him. But most of all, we need to be challenged by him. I like Charles de Foucauld. After all of these years, he challenges me. There's not a day that I say, I need to love Jesus more. This Charles de Foucauld is madly in love with Jesus. Am I there yet? I want to live like that. And this is Nazareth. Nazareth is, I get up in the morning and I brush my teeth, and this is what Jesus did. Get up in the morning, brush his teeth, went to work. Blessed Mother packed his lunch, and Joseph, and they did this. The first 50 times you change diapers, you think, wow, this is a fantastic kid. And the 500th time you change a diaper, you say, oh my God. How do we do everything with love? How do we do? This is Nazareth. That we don't have to be conscious of the presence of God. It would be wonderful if we were conscious. I don't have to be conscious of the presence of God. It's wonderful if I can be conscious of the presence of God. I don't look at Foucault. He saw the presence of God where nobody saw the presence of God. And this is why the desert is so important to him. I wish I had time to look at how Foucault loved the desert and how important adoration of the Blessed Sacrament was to him. And how he really was the one who really used the word, the fundamental option for the poor. Charles de Foucauld, he says the fundamental option for the poor. So much there that we can learn from. So I pray that these few moments will be just enough to touch you so that this great man, he can help you to love the Lord. Yes, but we love the Lord, he said, by loving one another. Dorothy Day said the most painful words. She said, we love God as much as the person we love least. When I get to heaven, God's going to look like the person I love least. That's tough. And so this inclusive love, I ask the Lord in all my heart to help us to look at that inclusive love. Go beyond that judgment. Say, look, I expect more from people than I expect from myself. I ask the Lord to give you a very special gift. And so I pray through the intercession of St. Charles de Foucauld and also his good friend Louis Massignon, who is also a great saint, that we can unconditionally love one another, as the unconditional love God has created us and constantly recreates us. Amen.